I know failure well.
In the dark corners of a world steeped in horror and madness, a new challenge awaits. Welcome to Darkest Dungeon 2 LT Gamers, the highly anticipated sequel to the acclaimed turn-based RPG that took the gaming world by storm. In this game, if you don't know, you'll lead a band of unlikely heroes on a perilous journey through a grim, Lovecraftian-inspired world. As you explore eerie ruins, dark caverns, you'll face unimaginable horrors that threaten not only your characters' lives, but also their sanity. You'll need to carefully manage your party of adventurers, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, and unique abilities. From the stalwart man-at-arms to the alchemical prowess of the Plague Doctor, you'll need to choose your team wisely and devise strategies that maximize their potential. This is obviously the follow-up game to the massive hit that was Darkest Dungeon that took the world by surprise. So let's dive into this game, let's look at the gameplay, new features, and how it measures up to the original. Of course, before we get going, we have to say make sure to like the video and help us on YouTube with the algorithm. Leave a comment with your thoughts about the game yourself or what you're hoping the game will be. And lastly, consider subscribing if you enjoy our content, as we're growing super fast and me and Luke are really excited to hit 5k this year. Let's go! So first of all, let's dive into the most important aspect of any game, the gameplay. So Darkest Dungeon 2 introduces some changes to the core gameplay mechanics of the original, while also striving to maintain the challenging, strategic aspects that made it a hit in the first place. So let's take a closer look and see how it measures up. Like the original game, Darkest Dungeon 2 features turn-based combat system where you take turns with your enemies to attack, defend, heal, and buff your party. And terrain, enemy placement all play a big role in the battles, so you have to, think about how you position your characters strategically and make the most of their unique abilities to gain the upper hand. So all sounds fairly familiar and similar so far. Party composition and strategy remain crucial in Darkest Dungeon 2, and you'll need to choose the right combinations of character classes, skills, and gear to face and overcome the challenges ahead. You still have the diverse roster of characters to choose from, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, and there is a lot of options for customization and specialization. I would say what they've tried to do here in particular is add different paths for characters to follow. So you, for example, can have the highwayman and he has a rogue path, which really emphasizes a certain set of his skills and gives bonuses whilst hindering him in other aspects. There's also the sharpshooter path for the highwayman as well, and that is more focused on range and increasing his damage with those skills. So it gives a new look to how you can customize the characters overall. The stress system also returns in Darkest Dungeon 2, keeping that layer of mental challenge to the game. Your characters become stressed as usual from various sources, and if their stress gets too high, they develop afflictions that hinder their performance. So managing stress is still an essential part of the game, and to be honest, finding a way to heal your stress is vital to success on any good run. So the Darkest Dungeon's roster of characters each has their own unique abilities and playstyles. So what I would say here, and what is kind of disappointing to me and I think the wider fan base, is there are less characters in this than in the original. Whilst they've tried to add more paths in which to customize the characters, it still feels to me like there's less choice overall, just because there are less character types. I used to like finding in Darkest Dungeon that unique synergy of characters, and suddenly I would be inflicting insane amounts of bleed and really dealing damage to the enemies every turn, or similarly with using blight skills. With the current system, you start with 4 characters, and it actually takes a while for you to feel like you have the freedom to unlock others. And it's yeah, it's lost some of that spark in that manner for me, because I felt like had less choice, and I was kind of driven towards using certain characters like the Highwayman as they had the best skill sets available. So whilst Darkest Dungeon 2 retains core gameplay mechanics that made the original a hit, I do think a lot of people are going to find that the sequel falls short in certain areas. Another element which has changed in Darkest Dungeon 2 is the way you enter the dungeons, as it were. So gone are the static dungeons that you would enter, like the ruins or whatever it may be, and you are now in a stagecoach and you're traveling from inn to inn, and you're picking different pathways along your route. To me, I also didn't like this system as much as the previous one, and I felt like I had less control over where I was going and less strategy in which to pick my path. I wasn't always a fan of having to kind of drive the stagecoach as well. It kind of grated on me, I would say, after some time. And so yeah, I definitely preferred the setup in the original, but that could just be my personal taste as well. But while Darkest Dungeon 2 does actually retain many of the core gameplay mechanics that made the original a hit, I do think some fans are going to feel like the sequel falls short in many areas. The revamps to the camping system, so you now go from inn to inn and then use your recovery options in between. Whereas in the previous game you had your firewood and you had to choose when to deploy that. I really liked that system, as you know, it became a balancing act of either going too early and suffering there, or going too late and paying the consequences with that strategy. So I feel like it's a little less immersive and strategic because you literally go from inn to inn, and there's a lot less options, I feel, to heal yourself overall. So I could say that maybe it feels like the overall challenge level's been toned down as well, to make it feel less punishing and maybe rewarding, if you want to think of it that way, than the original. So in summary, I would say the gameplay has retained a lot of the elements, and particularly the strategy that made the original a hit, but it's introduced many changes that may not please all the fans, and I would probably be in the latter group there. Darkest Dungeon 2 is a game that is much about story and setting as it is about the gameplay. So let's dive into the narrative and the Lovecraftian horror elements and see how they compare back to the original. So it takes place in the same bleak apocalyptic world where the forces of darkness and madness are spreading, and they've spread even further in this game. Players explore a variety of locations, from crumbling cities to twisted forests, each with their own unique challenges, bosses, and horrors. The game's procedurally generated dungeons do ensure that no two runs feel exactly the same, and this does add to the replayability factor that the original was known for. You meet along your journeys lots of different characters and factions, and some can kind of offer you aid or respite in some way, whereas others can be a lot more difficult to deal with. So the game's narrative is more subtle and open-ended than the original, and it leaves players to kind of make a bit more choice in their actions. Darkest Dungeon 2 is steeped in Lovecraftian horror elements, from eldritch monsters and twisted landscapes to the themes of madness, corruption, and sacrifice. The game has the same focus as before on character stress and afflictions, and reinforces this idea that sanity is a fragile thing in this world, and even the strongest heroes can be broken by the horrors they face. While Darkest Dungeon 2 continues to deliver the same compelling and Lovecraftian atmosphere as the original, I do think some people will find that the game's narrative lacks the focus and coherence of the original. It does feel a little bit more murky in what they're trying to say. The open-ended structure is a little less immersive for me, and I found that although the original was very linear in the way it progressed, it was much more engaging. And I would say, to summarize the story and setting, might not live up to the high standards that were set by the original game, it still does offer a unique and immersive experience for fans of this Lovecraftian horror and dark fantasy. With the procedurally generated dungeons, diverse set of characters, and kind of strategic elements to your choices, I do think the story does contribute very well to the game overall. And so we've covered the gameplay and the storytelling elements, but I think it'd be a good idea to just kind of do a synopsis of the features and improvements that they've tried to make in this game. So one of the most significant is, as I mentioned before, the camping system being kind of removed and added more to this inn system. And I think they've done this to create more of a scarcity of resources. Along with this, they've changed the way characters can be progressed. It's a lot more expanded, and there's a lot more customization options per character. And so you have a lot more, I would say, options to choose your heroes and cater them towards your playstyle and preferences. I would also say, we can't go through this without going through the enhanced graphics and sound design, which makes the game's Lovecraftian horrors even more vivid and immersive. This is one definite improvement that I've seen and experienced, that the game's hand-drawn art style, haunting sound effects really create that sense of dread and unease. And the upgraded UI and animations make the game much more fluid and intuitive. However, I will have to say that some of the improvements in Darkest Dungeon 2 have come at the cost of the original game's charm and simplicity. So we mentioned the camping system, but for me it felt a bit overly complex and fiddly to know which items I should emphasize and get. And I just found myself buying random assortments, often at the inns. The expanded customization options often felt a bit aimless and maybe distracting, and I couldn't really focus in on the individuals as much, and it kind of withdrew away what made the original game so compelling to me. So one aspect it does match up for me is the replayability. I do think the procedurally generated dungeons do make it feel fresh each run, and it's still very unpredictable even after multiple playthroughs, just like the original. So, is Darkest Dungeon 2 worth playing? Is it worth buying? As I've said throughout this review, I feel like it doesn't surpass the original in many aspects. You can argue that I think the UI and graphics are probably the most marked increase in performance in this game. I would say a lot of the features they added, I could get where they were coming from with them, but I'm not a fan of how they've been executed. So I would say that the game falls short of the original's greatness and uniqueness. Particularly the characters, the fact there's less to choose from in this one was really a detracting factor for me. That being said, I would also note that with the original game, the studio continued to work on it a long time after it was published, and so that's an encouraging thought to me that they're going to be working and improving the game overall, and this is what they've said in recent blog posts as well. My only caveat there is I hope they don't do it through DLC, as I do feel like the game needs to be fleshed out a lot more for it to become a really compelling experience like the original. So to summarize, what would I say? I think that Darkest Dungeon 2 is a good game, and I've played about 30 hours into it right now, and it has kept me coming back for more. It is still an enjoyable experience. It just falls far short of the original. It hasn't gripped me in the same way. It hasn't been as innovative in the same way. I can only hope that they continue to work on the game and, expand the amount of content there is available, and I do think it could get to a much better place. But right now, if I had to choose to purchase either this one or the original, I would still pick the original, which is not a great thing for me to say about a new game that's been released and is supposedly supposed to surpass what they did originally. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this review and are able to take some valuable information away from it. If you have enjoyed it, please drop us a like. It helps with the algorithm. Let me know a comment on what you thought, what you think of the game or what you thought of the review. And of course, always feel free to subscribe to our journey that we're on. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye bye now.